It started as a dare, like so many bad ideas do. There was a dense, overgrown forest behind our high school, one that stretched for miles without a single walking path. The older students always told stories about it, missing pets, strange figures in the trees, and even a few kids who had supposedly vanished after venturing too far. No one believed the stories, but the forest had a reputation. So when Jake dared me and a few others to go in after dark, I couldn't say no. Peer pressure is a powerful thing when you're 16 and want to fit in. It wasn't just me though. There were 4 of us: Jake, Sarah, Greg, and me. We all agreed to meet behind the gym after the last class. We snuck past the parking lot as the sun dipped low, slipping into the trees before anyone could see us. The moment we stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It felt like we'd walked into a different world. The trees were tall and thick, their branches twisted into strange shapes that blocked out what little light was left. The air was damp, and the only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves and our footsteps crunching on the underbrush. "Come on, don't be a bunch of wimps," Jake said, taking the lead with his usual cocky grin. He was always the one pushing limits, always the one who had to prove something. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances but followed. We didn't have a plan. The dare was simple: go deep into the woods, find something weird, and come back. I think we all assumed it would be a quick in and out. But the deeper we went, the stranger things started to feel. The first sign that something was off came about 30 minutes in. We found an old clearing, with what looked like a half-burned campsite in the center. The ashes were scattered, the remnants of a fire long dead, but there were bones mixed in with the debris, small ones, like from an animal, maybe a cat or dog. "Probably some homeless guy," Sarah said, her voice uneasy. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to be watching us. "Nah, this looks old," Greg said, squatting next to the ashes. "Whoever was here, they haven't been back in a long time." Jake, of course, wasn't fazed. "Keep moving, we haven't found anything cool yet." The thing is, I could tell none of us wanted to keep going. Something about that clearing felt wrong, like we were trespassing on something ancient, something dangerous. But no one wanted to be the first to back out, so we pressed on. Another 20 minutes or so passed, and that's when we started hearing it. Whispers, just on the edge of hearing. At first I thought it was the wind, but the way it moved around us, circling us, made it clear it wasn't natural. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper itself. Jake stopped, his cocky grin gone. "It's just the wind, don't freak out." But it wasn't the wind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but still too soft to make out any words. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching us, talking about us. "We should go back," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We've come far enough." "No way," Jake snapped. "We're not turning around until we find something." That's when we saw it. Through the trees there was an old decrepit building, more of a shack covered in moss and vines. It looked like it had been there for decades, untouched. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, and the windows were dark and cracked. "What the hell is that?" Greg muttered. Jake grinned. "Looks like we found our something weird, let's check it out." I didn't want to go any closer, and I could tell Sarah and Greg didn't either. But Jake was already walking toward the shack, so we followed. The whispers were louder now, almost like they were coming from inside the building. When we reached the door, Jake pushed it open with a loud creak. The inside was even worse than the outside. The floor was covered in dirt and dead leaves, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. But what got to me were the walls. They were covered in carvings, strange symbols I'd never seen before, and all around them were crude drawings of people. Dozens of them, all in a circle, surrounding something in the center. "Okay, this is creepy as hell," Greg said, taking a step back. "We should leave." "Don't be a baby," Jake replied, but his voice didn't have its usual confidence. "It's just graffiti. Some kids probably did this years ago." But it didn't feel like graffiti. It felt ancient, like it had been there long before the shack had started falling apart. Sarah walked toward the drawings, her eyes scanning the symbols. "These aren't kids' drawings," she said, her voice trembling. "This is something else." Suddenly the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then from the far corner of the room came a low guttural sound, a growl, deep and menacing. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my heart racing. Jake turned toward the sound, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "There's something in here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Then we saw it, a pair of eyes, glowing in the darkness, staring back at us from the corner. They were too high up to belong to any animal I'd ever seen, and they were filled with a malevolent intelligence. "Run!" Sarah screamed, and we bolted for the door. We ran as fast as we could, crashing through the trees, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. The whispers were back, louder than ever, now mixed with the sound of something chasing us, something big, something fast. I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I kept running, driven by pure terror. I could hear Sarah and Greg behind me, their breathing ragged, but I couldn't hear Jake. We burst out of the forest and into the schoolyard, collapsing onto the grass. The whispers stopped, and the night was silent again, save for our gasping breaths. "Where's Jake?" Greg asked, looking around frantically. I looked back at the forest, my heart sinking. Jake was gone. We waited, shouting his name, but there was no response. He had vanished into the trees, just like all the others. The police searched the forest for days, but they never found any trace of him. The next time I went to the school, I avoided the back gate. I don't know what we found that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that the forest took Jake, and whatever's out there, it's still waiting. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing much ever happens. My family lived in a modest 2-story house that had been in the family for generations. It wasn't anything special, just an old, creaky home with a lot of history. And like most old houses, it had its share of quirks, the occasional draft, the sounds of wood settling at night, and a few dark corners we tried not to think about. But there was one part of the house that always gave me the creeps, the attic. Growing up, I never went in there, and my parents rarely did either. They kept it locked, saying it was just filled with old junk and nothing worth worrying about. The only time I ever saw the door open was when my dad would head up there to check on something or grab a box. Even then, it was a quick trip, and he'd close it up tight as soon as he was done. I never asked why, but I always had the feeling that they were keeping something from me. I didn't think much of it until I was about 16. That's when the strange things started happening. It began with little noises, faint creaks, and taps coming from above my bedroom late at night. At first I figured it was just the house settling, or maybe a squirrel that had gotten into the walls. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, like someone pacing back and forth. It always happened at the same time, around 2 or 3 in the morning, and it always stopped just before sunrise. I told my parents about it, but they brushed it off. "It's an old house," my dad said. "It makes noises." But it wasn't just the noises. After a few weeks I started noticing other things, small things at first, like my bedroom door being slightly ajar when I knew I'd closed it. Items on my dresser would be moved, just a few inches out of place. My mom would say I was being forgetful, that I must have left the door open or knocked something over, but I knew better. One night, the footsteps were louder than usual. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wide awake and listening. The sound of soft thuds, slow and rhythmic, echoed down from the attic. I stared up, trying to figure out what could be making that sound. It wasn't random, like the settling of wood. It was too purposeful. Then I heard something else, a faint scraping sound like nails being dragged across the floor above me. I shot up in bed, heart pounding. I wanted to get up and run downstairs, but something held me in place. The house was dead silent except for that scraping sound, and it seemed to be moving. Slowly it shifted across the ceiling from one end of my room to the other. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. The next morning, I confronted my parents again, but they seemed more irritated than concerned. "You're just hearing things," my mom said. "There's nothing up there." But I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, maybe. It was quick, but it was there. That night, I decided I'd had enough. If they weren't going to do anything about it, I would. So, after they'd gone to bed, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the attic door. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the door, my hand hovering over the old brass handle. The house was quiet, but I knew that wouldn't last. Soon enough, those footsteps would start again. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. A musty smell wafted out, the scent of dust and decay. The narrow staircase leading up to the attic was steep, and the darkness at the top seemed impenetrable. I clicked on the flashlight and began to climb. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I made my way up, and the air grew colder the higher I went. By the time I reached the top, my breath was visible in front of me. I shone the flashlight around the attic, revealing a cluster of old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and thick cobwebs that hung from the beams like curtains. At first, everything seemed normal. It was just an old attic, filled with years of junk. But then, as I swept the flashlight across the floor, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the thick layer of dust covering the floorboards, there were footprints, not the small scurrying prints of an animal, but human footprints, bare and fresh. They led from the far corner of the attic, near an old wardrobe, straight toward the staircase where I was standing. I followed the prints with the flashlight, my heart racing. They stopped right at the top of the stairs, right where I was standing now. My hand trembled as I lowered the beam of light to the floor, and that's when I saw it. A set of footprints that weren't mine, standing just inches away from me. Bare feet, pressed deep into the dust as if someone, or something, had been standing there watching me. I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet in my panic. I slammed the attic door shut behind me and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my room, flashlight clutched in my hand, waiting for the footsteps to start again. But they didn't. The house was silent, eerily so. But the fear didn't go away. It clung to me like a shadow, following me through the next day and the one after that. I told my parents what I'd found, but they still wouldn't believe me. They said it was my imagination, that I'd let the ghost stories get to me. But I knew what I'd seen. And I knew that something was up there, in the attic. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. But this time, they weren't coming from the attic. They were coming from the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. I froze, my heart racing as I listened. The footsteps were slow and heavy, pacing just outside my room. I didn't dare move. I barely even breathed. Then, the door creaked open. It was slight, just a crack, but enough to let a sliver of darkness spill into my room. I stared at the door, unable to move, unable to do anything but wait. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, just barely visible in the dim light of the hallway. It was standing just outside the door, its shape indistinct but unmistakable. It stood there for a long time as if deciding whether or not to come in. My heart pounded so hard in my chest I thought it might give me away. Then, as quietly as it had come, it was gone. The door clicked shut and the footsteps retreated down the hall, growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared altogether. I never opened the attic door again after that. I didn't need to. I knew whatever was up there wasn't bound to the attic anymore. It was in the house, and it wasn't leaving. When I was around 18, I spent a summer working at a small family-owned camp in upstate New York. It was one of those old-fashioned places, wooden cabins, a big lake for swimming, and plenty of hiking trails. The camp itself was in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest town. It was peaceful, and I figured it would be a great way to make some money before heading off to college. The job was simple enough, helping with maintenance, keeping the grounds clean, and occasionally leading campers on nature walks. The camp had a main area where all the cabins were located, clustered around the lake. But further back, deeper in the woods, was an old run-down cabin that was off-limits to everyone. The camp owners never talked about it, but the other staff and older campers liked to tell stories. They called it the Old Counselor's Cabin, and said it had been abandoned for years. Some of the stories claimed that a counselor had died there decades ago, under mysterious circumstances. Others said it was just a storage shed, left to rot in the woods. But every version had one thing in common: no one went near it, No one. I didn't buy into the rumors. The first time I heard about the cabin, I laughed it off. It sounded like typical campfire horror stories meant to scare the younger kids. But as the weeks went on, I noticed something strange. No matter how curious or brave the campers claimed to be, no one ever talked about exploring the woods behind the main camp. It was as if everyone had silently agreed that it was better to leave the old cabin alone. One evening after the campers had gone to bed, a couple of U.S. staff members were hanging out by the fire pit. We were trading stories, laughing, and having a few beers when someone brought up the old cabin again. Everyone fell quiet. That's when Eric, one of the older staff members, turned to me with a smirk. "You don't believe in that crap, do you?" he asked. "Not really," I said. "I mean, it's just an old building, right?" Eric raised an eyebrow. "Tell you what. If you're so sure it's nothing, why don't you go check it out?" I could feel everyone's eyes on me. The fire crackled in the background, and the woods around us seemed darker, more silent than usual. I knew it was just a dare, but something about the way Eric said it made me uneasy. Still, I wasn't about to back down in front of everyone, so I shrugged. "Fine, I'll go check it out." The group cheered and joked, but there was an underlying tension that I couldn't shake. Eric handed me a flashlight, and I started walking toward the edge of camp. I glanced back once, seeing them all watching me, half expecting me to chicken out. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. The path to the old cabin was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and underbrush. The further I walked, the quieter it got. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of branches. After about 15 minutes, I saw it. The old cabin, barely visible in the moonlight, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the trees. It was smaller than I expected, just a single-story structure with a sagging roof and broken windows. The wood was rotting, and vines had crept up the walls, wrapping around the building like nature was trying to reclaim it. I shined my flashlight on the door, which hung slightly open. I could see just enough of the interior to know it was filled with shadows. Something about the cabin made my skin crawl, but I wasn't about to back out now. I walked up to the door and pushed it open with my foot. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty woods. Inside, the air was thick and musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The floor was covered in dust and debris, and a few pieces of old broken furniture were scattered around. There was nothing particularly creepy about the place. No signs of anyone living there, no strange markings on the walls, just an abandoned, forgotten cabin. But then, something caught my eye. In the far corner of the room, next to an old overturned chair, was a small pile of papers. I walked over, kneeling to get a better look. They were damp and yellowed with age, but I could still make out writing on some of them. Most of it was illegible, but one word kept appearing over and over: "Stay." I picked up one of the papers, my fingers shaking slightly. It was written in the same jagged handwriting, the word "stay" scrawled over the entire page, like someone had written it in a frenzy. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a soft sound, almost like a whisper, but I couldn't make out what it was. Slowly, I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the door. There was nothing there, just the empty doorway and the dark woods beyond. I stepped back, suddenly feeling like I wasn't alone in the cabin. The air felt heavier and colder. My flashlight flickered, and in the dim light, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye, a shadow, shifting just out of sight. I turned quickly, shining the light around the room. Nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. It felt like the walls were closing in, like something was watching me from just beyond the reach of the light. Then the whisper came again, this time clearer. "Stay." I spun around, my heart racing. I didn't care about looking brave anymore. I bolted for the door, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the fire pit, panting, my chest tight with fear. The others looked at me, wide-eyed. Eric stood up, laughing nervously. "So, you see anything?" I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. "Just an old cabin," I lied. But that night as I lay in bed I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the papers, the word "stay" written over and over, and the whisper. It had been real. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The next morning, I woke up to a loud commotion. One of the younger staff members, a guy named Tim, had gone missing. We searched the camp, the surrounding woods, and even the lake, but there was no sign of him. No one talked about the cabin, but I knew where he had gone. And I knew that whatever was out there had taken him. I left the camp that day, telling the owners I had a family emergency and couldn't stay the rest of the summer. I never went back. Years later, I heard the camp had shut down. Some people said it was because of financial troubles. Others whispered that it was something else, something that had been waiting in the woods for too long. I've tried to forget about that summer, but I can still hear the whisper sometimes, late at night. Stay. A few years ago I worked as a park ranger in a remote national park in the Pacific Northwest. My job wasn't fascinating, mostly routine patrols, checking in on campers, and ensuring people weren't wandering too far off the trails. The park was beautiful, dense with towering pines, crystal clear lakes, and miles of unmarked wilderness. It was the kind of place where people went to disconnect, to be swallowed up by nature. But there was something else about the park. Something that the older rangers never talked about openly, but always seemed to linger in their expressions. A kind of unspoken rule to not venture too far into the northern parts of the park. The visitors didn't know about it, but those of us who worked there did. In my 3rd year on the job, something happened that I can't explain. And even though it's been years since I left that job, I still can't shake the feeling that there are things in those woods, things that shouldn't be disturbed. It started with a missing campers report. A couple, early 30s, both experienced hikers, had been off the grid for 3 days. They were supposed to check in with the main ranger station before heading back to their car. When they didn't show up, their family called us, and a search team was dispatched. I was assigned to search the northern part of the park, near an area we rarely patrolled. It was deep, wild, and isolated, with trails that hadn't been maintained in years. The rangers used to patrol it regularly, but over time, we were told to stay away. They never gave a clear reason why, just warnings about rough terrain and dangerous wildlife. But I always suspected it was more than that. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth as I made my way through the underbrush, following a faint trail that wound its way deeper into the forest. I had a GPS tracker, but the further I went, the more unreliable it became, blinking in and out as if the signal was being jammed. After a while, I turned it off, and decided to rely on my instincts and the map I'd brought. After a few hours of hiking, I found something that set off alarm bells in my mind, an old campsite, long abandoned. The fire pit was nothing more than a pile of stones, overgrown with moss. There were remnants of gear scattered around, tents shredded by time and weather. At first, I thought it was just an old, forgotten site, but something about it felt wrong. The way the trees around it seemed to close in, almost like they were hiding something. I radioed in my location and decided to search the area more thoroughly. As I moved deeper into the trees, I noticed something that made my skin crawl, a trail of clothing, as if someone had been stripping down as they walked. A jacket here, a torn boot there, and finally, a ripped, weather-beaten backpack hanging from a low branch. The weirdest part? The clothing wasn't old. It looked like it had been there for only a few days. I found a wallet inside the backpack with a driver's license. It was one of the missing hikers, a guy named David. The sight of it made my stomach turn. I'd never found a missing person's belongings before, and the reality of the situation hit me hard. Something was very, very wrong. As the sun began to set, I knew I had to head back to base camp and report what I'd found. But the sense of being watched grew stronger with every step I took. The forest was too quiet. Not the peaceful, serene quiet I was used to, but an oppressive silence that made every sound I made feel deafening. I picked up the pace, trying to make it back to the main trail before nightfall. But as I turned a corner, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There, in a small clearing, stood a figure. At first I thought it was a person, a man, dressed in tattered mud-streaked clothing. But the longer I stared, the more I realized something wasn't right. He was too still, too stiff, like he was frozen in place. His head was tilted slightly to one side, and his face. I couldn't make it out clearly. It was as though it was blurred, like a face you try to remember from a dream but can't quite grasp. I called out to him, but he didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a cautious step forward, reaching for the flashlight in my belt. But before I could shine it on him, he moved, not toward me but backward, slowly fading into the trees like he was melting into the forest itself. I didn't follow. Something in me, a primal, gut instinct, screamed at me to turn around and run. And I did. I sprinted through the woods, barely able to keep track of the trail as darkness began to fall. Every snapping twig and every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran. By the time I reached the ranger station, I was out of breath, my mind racing with what I had seen. I told the others about the old campsite, the clothing, and the figure in the woods. The lead ranger, an older guy named Frank, listened quietly, his face expressionless. When I finished, he stood up, walked over to the map on the wall, and circled a large area in red marker. "That's the northern part of the park," he said, his voice low. "We don't go there anymore." "Why?" I asked, my voice shaky. "What's out there?" Frank looked at me, his eyes tired and dark. "Something that shouldn't be." I tried to press him for more, but he wouldn't say anything else. Just that the search for the missing hikers would be called off and that I shouldn't talk about what I'd seen. The official report would say they were lost to the wilderness, their bodies never found. I didn't argue. I didn't want to know any more than I already did. A week later I quit my job as a park ranger. I couldn't stay there after what I'd seen, and I didn't want to know what else was lurking in those woods. The couple was never found, and their disappearance remains unsolved. Sometimes late at night, I think about that figure in the woods, the way it moved, the way it seemed to blend into the trees, and I wonder if it was watching me the whole time, waiting for me to get too close. I don't go hiking anymore. Not after that. Because deep down, I know that whatever is out there, in that northern part of the park, is still waiting, still watching. And I'm not sure it's done yet. I never expected my first cruise to be anything more than a relaxing getaway. After months of working insane hours, I finally decided to treat myself and booked a 7-day Caribbean cruise. The ship, Ocean Wanderer, was enormous, one of those floating cities with everything from swimming pools to theaters. I imagined lazy afternoons by the pool, nights spent watching live shows, and endless buffets. What I didn't expect was the strange encounter that would leave me questioning my sanity. The first few days were exactly what I had hoped for. The weather was perfect, the food was great, and the sea stretched out endlessly in every direction. I was sharing a cabin with another solo traveler, Daniel. He was around my age, late 20s, with an easygoing attitude that made it easy to get along. We weren't best friends or anything, but we shared a few drinks and talked about what to do at the next port. It was the 4th night when things began to feel off. Daniel had gone out to one of the bars, so I was alone in the cabin, lying on my bed and scrolling through my phone. The gentle rocking of the ship usually lulled me to sleep. But that night, it felt different. I felt restless, like something was keeping me awake. I tried closing my eyes and forcing myself to relax, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The sound of the ship's engines, usually a low, comforting hum, seemed louder that night, almost like a rumble deep in my chest. I decided to go for a walk, hoping that the fresh air would calm my nerves. I threw on a hoodie and left the cabin, planning to head to the upper deck for some peace. But as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something strange. The hallway was empty. It wasn't that odd at first. It was past midnight, and most of the passengers were probably asleep or still in the bars. But something was unnerving about the silence. No sounds of laughter, no footsteps, no doors opening or closing. Just me and the long, dimly lit hallway stretching in both directions. I shrugged it off and headed toward the stairs. As I walked, I passed by cabin after cabin, glancing at the room numbers out of boredom. When I got to cabin 437, I froze. The door was slightly ajar. I slowed down, staring at it. None of the other doors were open, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. Something about that door made my skin crawl. It wasn't wide open, just a crack, but it was enough for the light from the hallway to spill inside. I don't know why, but I stopped and listened. It was quiet at first, just the hum of the ship. But then I heard it, a faint sound, like whispering. It was so soft I almost thought I was imagining it, but it was there. A low, rhythmic murmur, as if someone was talking just on the other side of the door. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, trying to hear what was being said, but the words were indistinguishable. I was inches from the door now, and I couldn't stop myself from peeking through the crack. Inside, the room was dark except for the faint glow from the hallway. The bed closest to the door was neatly made, but the other bed, someone was sitting on it. It was hard to make out at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure sitting with their back to me, hunched over. They were completely still, their head lowered as if they were staring at something in their lap. I could barely make out their shape, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I backed away, feeling the cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I don't know why I didn't just walk away. Maybe it was the eerie stillness, or maybe it was the strange rhythmic sound that continued to whisper from the room. Suddenly the figure moved. They didn't turn around, didn't stand up. Instead they lifted their head, as if acknowledging my presence. I took a step back, my heart thudding in my ears, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the crack in the door. That's when the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and then, slowly, the figure began to turn toward me. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to see their face. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The figure unnaturally twisted its neck, its head turning far too slowly, as if each movement was deliberate and painful. As the face came into view, I saw it wasn't a normal person. The skin was gray, almost translucent, and the eyes were wide and empty, like black holes. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. The door creaked open wider, and the figure stood up, towering in the darkness. It didn't make a sound as it stepped toward the hallway, toward me. I scrambled to my feet, panic surging through my body. I didn't look back as I bolted down the hallway, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. My only thought was to get away from whatever that thing was. I reached the stairwell and rushed up to the main deck, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The cool night air hit me as I burst outside, but I didn't stop running until I reached the far side of the ship. There, under the dim glow of the deck lights, I collapsed onto a bench, trying to calm myself. I could still see that figure, those black, empty eyes staring back at me. I stayed outside for what felt like hours, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I tried to find out who was staying in cabin 437. I asked the front desk, but the receptionist just looked at me like I was crazy. "Sir," she said, flipping through her records, "there is no cabin 437 on this ship." I argued with her, insisting that I had seen it, that it was real. But she showed me the floor plans. There was no cabin 437. It didn't exist. I went back to that hallway, half expecting to find it again, but the numbers skipped from 436 to 438. Cabin 437 was gone, as if it had never been there. I spent the rest of the cruise on edge, unable to enjoy anything. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being followed, watched by something just out of sight. I didn't tell Daniel, didn't tell anyone else on board. But the last night, as I was packing my things, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tucked under my bed was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. I hesitated, then opened it. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "Don't look, don't follow." Needless to say, I've never taken a cruise again. I don't know what I saw that night, or if I imagined the whole thing, but now and then, I'll have a nightmare about that figure in the dark, its face twisted in that impossible, unnatural way. And each time, I wake up wondering if I'll ever truly escape what I saw on the Ocean Wanderer. I was a real estate agent for about 10 years. I've seen houses in all sorts of conditions, immaculate, run down, and everything in between. But nothing could have prepared me for the house on Sycamore Hill. It was an old Victorian, the kind with high, pointed roofs and wide porches that wrap around the entire front. The house had been on the market for years, untouched and abandoned. The owners had moved out abruptly and left it as is. The last real estate agent who handled it said she had no luck selling it and she was done with it. She never explained why, and I didn't ask. I took on the listing thinking it was just a neglected house in need of a little TLC. I had dealt with plenty of those before, and they usually sold well after a bit of sprucing up. From the outside the house didn't seem too bad, just a little weathered. The paint was peeling, and the windows looked grimy, but it had that old-world charm people are often willing to pay for. Plus it was huge, 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a massive yard and a basement. For the right buyer, it would be a dream home. I went to check it out one gloomy Tuesday afternoon. The sky was overcast, and there was a drizzle, giving the whole area an eerie, washed-out look. As I pulled up to the house, I noticed something strange. The air around the property felt odd heavy. It wasn't just the weather, it was something more. The trees that lined the street, once full and vibrant, looked sickly. Their leaves were sparse, and the bark was almost gray as if the life had been sucked out of them. I shook it off, telling myself it was just an old house, and my imagination was getting the best of me. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual for a property that had been vacant for years. The owners had left most of their furniture behind, dusty, covered in sheets, but still there. It felt like stepping into a time capsule. I could almost picture the house as it had been decades ago, lively and full of people. But the air inside was thick, stagnant. Every breath I took felt labored, like something was weighing it down. I tried to ignore the sensation and started my usual walkthrough, making mental notes of what needed fixing. Cracks in the walls, some water damage in the ceiling, scuffed floors. As I moved from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started in the dining room. The room was large, with tall windows that looked out onto the overgrown backyard. As I was checking the windows for leaks, I heard a soft creak behind me, like someone was slowly pressing down on a floorboard. I spun around, but no one was there. I laughed at myself, chalking it up to the house settling. Old houses make noise, I reminded myself. But the creaking continued. It was subtle, like footsteps slowly crossing the room, but always staying just out of sight. I tried to shake the feeling, finished up in the dining room, and moved on to the second floor. As I climbed the stairs, I could hear faint whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe a draft sneaking through the cracked windows. But the closer I got to the top of the stairs, the clearer the voices became. It sounded like a conversation, but too low for me to make out the words. I stopped on the landing, straining to hear. It wasn't coming from the outside. The voices were inside the house. I stood there for what felt like minutes, trying to make sense of it, when suddenly the voices stopped. The house was deathly silent. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe the wind creating a strange echo in the old house, and pressed on. The second floor was more of the same dusty, neglected rooms, filled with old furniture and discarded belongings. But when I reached the master bedroom, I froze. The bed was made, perfectly neat, as if someone had just straightened the sheets moments before I arrived. The rest of the house had been in complete disarray, but this room, it felt wrong. It was too perfect. The air in there was even heavier, almost suffocating. The whispers had started again, faint but unmistakable, and I could feel a presence in the room, like someone or something was standing just behind me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone there. But the room was empty. I left the bedroom quickly and made my way to the attic. The owners hadn't mentioned the attic, but I wanted to be thorough. The attic door was old and warped, sticking slightly as I tried to open it. When I finally got it open, a foul stench hit me, like rot and decay. I gagged and covered my nose, shining my flashlight into the dark space above. The attic was almost empty, except for a few scattered boxes, but something caught my eye in the far corner. It was a pile of old, rotting blankets, or what looked like them. But then, I noticed the outline of something underneath the blankets. Something big. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. As I got closer, I saw what it was, an old discolored mannequin, its face cracked and peeling. The clothes it wore were tattered, covered in dust and grime, but something about it was off, the way it was positioned, like it had been carefully placed there and left to rot. and its eyes were staring directly at me, unblinking, lifeless, but somehow aware. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I jumped, dropping my flashlight. The attic was plunged into darkness. The only sound was the pounding of my heart. I scrambled to grab the flashlight, my hands shaking, and when I finally turned it back on, the mannequin was gone. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was empty, but I could feel it watching me. Whatever had been there wasn't gone, it had just moved. I bolted for the attic door, yanking it open and running down the stairs 2 at a time. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the cold drizzle. The house loomed behind me, its dark windows watching, waiting. I never went back. A few months later I heard the house had been sold to a family who was new to the area. I didn't ask how they managed to sell it, and I didn't want to know. But not long after they moved in, I heard through the grapevine that they had left in the middle of the night, abandoning the house, just like the previous owners. The whispers had started again, they said, and something was in the attic. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a much-needed escape from the relentless pace of city life. My friend Mike and I had rented a small cabin on the outskirts of a sleepy town called Pine Ridge. It was late September, and the cool autumn air brought with it the smell of pine needles and damp earth. The cabin sat on the edge of a large field that stretched out toward a dense forest. The isolation was exactly what we needed, a break from work, noise, and responsibility. I'll never forget what happened that weekend. The first day was uneventful. We spent the afternoon exploring the woods, building a fire in the pit outside the cabin, and grilling up some steaks. By the time night fell, the sky was clear and full of stars, a sight we rarely saw in the city. Mike and I sat by the fire, beers in hand, and let the warmth soak into our bones. The stillness of the night felt comforting, and for the first time in months, I felt truly relaxed. Around 10 p.m., Mike suggested we head inside and watch a movie. I agreed, eager to wind down for the night. As I stood up to throw a couple of logs on the fire to keep it smoldering, I caught sight of something strange out in the field. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was just a shape, a dark figure standing about 50 yards away near the edge of the trees. I stared, trying to make out what it was, but the firelight wasn't strong enough to reach that far. "Hey Mike," I called, keeping my eyes on the shape. "You see that?" He walked over and squinted in the direction I was pointing. "What am I looking at?" "There, near the trees. Is that a person?" Mike paused for a second, then shrugged. "Maybe a hiker or a farmer. This is the middle of nowhere, man. People around here probably wander all over." "Yeah, maybe," I muttered. But something about the figure didn't sit right with me. They hadn't moved an inch, just stood there, almost like they were watching us. Mike slapped me on the back. "Forget it. Probably just some weirdo out for a walk. Let's head inside." We went into the cabin, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the figure again, but the field was empty. I tried to brush it off and focus on the movie we were watching, but the nagging feeling stayed with me. Around midnight, Mike crashed on the couch, snoring within minutes. I wasn't tired yet, so I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check on the fire. It was mostly out, just glowing embers left in the pit. I knelt to poke at it with a stick, debating whether to reignite it or let it burn itself out when I heard something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the field. I froze, every sense on high alert. The sound was faint but unmistakable, crunching grass underfoot, moving toward me. I stood up, my flashlight sweeping across the field, but there was nothing there. My pulse quickened as I listened, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the same dark figure, standing even closer now, maybe 30 yards away. I aimed the flashlight at them, but the beam only illuminated the space just short of where they stood. The light flickered for a moment, and I cursed under my breath, shaking the flashlight to bring it back to full strength. "Who's there?" I called, my voice betraying the fear that was creeping up on me. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move, just stood there, staring. Or at least I assumed it was staring. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me. A chill ran down my spine, and without thinking, I took a step backward toward the cabin. The figure took a step forward, mirroring my movement. My hand clenched the flashlight so tightly that I thought it might crack. I retreated again, and the figure took another step, this time faster. I turned and sprinted toward the cabin, bursting through the door and slamming it shut behind me. Mike jolted awake at the sound, blinking in confusion. "What the hell, man?" he mumbled. "There's someone out there," I gasped, locking the door. "They were standing in the field and they followed me when I backed away." Mike sat up, rubbing his eyes. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. Come here, look." We both went to the window, peering out into the night. The flashlight still lay outside on the ground where I had dropped it, casting a dim beam of light across the field. But the figure was gone. There was no one there. The field was empty. "I'm telling you, they were standing right there," I insisted, feeling a rising panic. Mike grabbed his jacket and his phone. "All right, let's go check it out. Maybe someone's messing with us." I didn't want to go back out there, but Mike wasn't the type to back down. We both grabbed flashlights and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my face like ice. The embers of the fire barely gave off any light, so our flashlights cut through the darkness like knives. We walked to the spot where I had seen the figure, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign of anyone having stood there. "Maybe you were seeing shadows," Mike suggested, but I shook my head. "I know what I saw." We spent another few minutes circling the field, but there was no one, nothing. Finally, we headed back inside, locking the door behind us. I tried to relax, but every little sound made me jump. It was well past 2 a.m. by the time I finally managed to fall asleep. The next morning, we decided to pack up early and cut the trip short. Whatever had happened, I didn't want to stick around to find out. As we loaded our bags into the car, Mike noticed something that made my stomach drop. Carved into the wooden post of the porch, just inches from the door, were 3 deep scratches, jagged and rough. They hadn't been there the night before. I didn't say anything as we drove away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure I saw wasn't human, that it had been watching us the whole time, waiting for the right moment. I've heard stories about strange happenings in isolated places, but I never thought I'd experience it myself. Whatever that thing was, it didn't want us there. And I have a feeling if we had stayed one more night, we wouldn't have made it back at all. I work as a night security guard at an old industrial complex on the outskirts of town. It's not a glamorous job, but it's quiet, and it pays the bills. The complex used to be a bustling factory back in the 50s, producing parts for automobiles. Now, it's mostly abandoned, with just a few warehouses still in use. The rest is a maze of rusting machinery, crumbling buildings, and long-forgotten rooms that haven't seen daylight in years. My job is simple: patrol the grounds every couple of hours, make sure no one's breaking in, and report any issues. For the most part, nothing ever happens. The place is dead quiet at night, and after a few months, the constant silence becomes almost comforting. That was until a few weeks ago. It was a typical night, and I was on my second round of patrol. The air was cool, and the usual hum of distant traffic from the highway was the only sound breaking the silence. I had my flashlight, radio, and keys, as always. I'd walked this route hundreds of times, and by now, I knew every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the old windows. But something felt different that night. I can't explain it, but there was a heaviness in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I made my way through one of the older buildings, a huge brick structure that had once been the main factory, I heard something, faint but distinct. It was the sound of metal scraping against metal, coming from below me. I stopped in my tracks, listening. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate screech, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. But the factory's basement had been sealed off for years. There was no way anyone could be down there. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to investigate. I made my way to the far end of the building, where I knew an old access hatch led down to the basement. It was hidden behind a pile of rusting crates and machinery that hadn't been moved in decades. I moved aside the debris, revealing the heavy steel door. It was bolted shut with thick iron locks that hadn't been touched in years. But something was wrong. The locks were broken. It wasn't a clean break either, like someone had used bolt cutters or some other tool. The metal looked twisted and warped, as if something had torn them apart with brute strength. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to radio my supervisor or go down and check it out myself, but my gut told me that whatever was down there, I didn't want to meet it. Against my better judgment, I pulled the hatch open. A wave of cold, damp air rushed up from below, carrying with it the stench of mold and decay. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, revealing a set of stone steps leading down into the bowels of the building. The scraping noise had stopped. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. But something was pulling me down there. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something stronger, something that felt almost like a compulsion. I took a deep breath and descended into the darkness. The stairs were narrow, and the walls dripped with moisture. The deeper I went, the colder it became. By the time I reached the bottom, I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. The basement was vast, much larger than I had expected. Rows of rusted machinery lined the walls, covered in decades of dust and grime. Broken pipes snaked across the ceiling, and the floor was littered with debris. But what immediately caught my attention was a large, gaping hole in the far wall. I approached cautiously, shining my light into the hole. It wasn't just a hole, it was a tunnel, stretching deep into the earth. The walls were rough, as if they'd been clawed out by hand, and the floor was uneven, littered with chunks of rock and dirt. I had never heard of any tunnel system beneath the factory. None of the blueprints I'd seen showed anything like this. It was like it had been hidden, forgotten for years. The scraping sound came again, this time echoing from deep within the tunnel. I should have turned back. I should have sealed the hatch and left the building without looking back. But something kept me moving forward, deeper into the tunnel. As I walked, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around me. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the rough stone walls. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, and now I could hear something else, whispers. Low guttural whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I pressed on, driven by a sense of dread I couldn't shake. After what felt like hours, I reached the end of the tunnel. My flashlight illuminated a small circular chamber carved into the rock. In the center of the room was an old rusted iron door, bolted shut with heavy chains. The door seemed out of place, as if it had been dragged down here from another time. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, filling my head. They weren't in any language I recognized, but I understood their intent. They were telling me to open the door. My hands shook as I reached for the chains. The metal was ice cold to the touch, and as I pulled at them, I realized they weren't as heavy as they looked. They came away easily, falling to the floor with a loud clatter that echoed through the chamber. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open. The stench that hit me was overwhelming, like a mix of rotting flesh and sulfur. I gagged, stumbling backward as I shone my flashlight into the room beyond. At first I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone, and the floor was littered with bones. Human bones. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the center of the room was a figure, hunched over and twitching. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skeletal frame, and its eyes, milky and unblinking, were locked onto me. It made no sound, but its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. I froze, unable to move as the thing slowly stood up, towering over me. It was impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It began to move toward me, its bones creaking with each step. I don't know how I found the strength to run, but I did. I bolted out of the chamber, and back through the tunnel, my flashlight flickering wildly as I sprinted toward the stairs. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. When I reached the stairs, I slammed the hatch shut and threw myself against it, panting and drenched in sweat. The whispers stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was my ragged breathing. I quit the job the next day without explanation. I never told anyone what I saw. I never went back to that complex. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispers. And I know that whatever I found down there is still waiting, deep beneath the earth. It's just waiting for someone else to open that door. It started as a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my girlfriend Lisa, and a couple of our friends, Jake, Natalie, and Chris. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, and we were all looking forward to getting out of the city for a few days. Jake had found this cabin on some rental site. It was isolated, deep in the woods near a place called Black Hollow, which none of us had ever heard of. The pictures made it look quaint: wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a large porch overlooking the forest. It seemed perfect. Secluded, quiet, a place where we could disconnect from everything and just relax. We all thought it would be great. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The drive took longer than expected. The roads became narrower the deeper we went into the woods, and eventually, we lost the signal on our phones. By the time we found the cabin, it was nearly dusk. The trees around the property were dense, their branches intertwining like claws stretching toward the sky. There was no other sign of civilization, no neighboring cabins, no hikers, nothing. Just the five of us, and the encroaching darkness. Jake was the first to notice something strange. "Hey, did anyone see another car pass us on the way up?" he asked, glancing around as we unloaded our gear from the SUV. We all shook our heads. "Not a single one," Lisa said. "But that's kind of the point, right? Get away from everything." Jake didn't respond right away, just kept looking at the tree line. "Yeah, I guess," he muttered. The cabin itself was exactly as advertised, rustic, with a slight musty smell, but nothing we couldn't handle. We quickly got settled, splitting up the rooms, and then gathered in the living room to start our weekend. Chris lit a fire, and soon we were all laughing, drinking, and playing board games like we'd planned. But as the night went on, I started to get the same uneasy feeling Jake had. The wind outside had picked up, and every so often it would howl through the trees, making the cabin creak in response. It wasn't just the wind, though. There was something else, like a faint tapping at the windows, but whenever I glanced over, there was nothing there. Just the trees swaying in the breeze. Around midnight, after we had all had a few too many drinks, Natalie suggested we go outside and look at the stars. "They're supposed to be amazing out here with no light pollution," she said, already grabbing her jacket. We all bundled up and stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold, the sky clear and vast. The stars were, as she promised, brilliant, shining brighter than any of us had ever seen before. But something was unnerving about the forest. The way the trees seemed to close in around the cabin. The way the wind sounded like whispers. And then, that tapping noise again. It was faint at first, almost like the wind playing tricks, but as we stood there, staring up at the sky, it grew louder. A steady, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. "Did you guys hear that?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all turned to look at him, and then toward the direction of the sound. It was coming from the back of the cabin. Slowly, cautiously, we walked around to the rear of the house, our breath visible in the cold night air. That's when we saw it. At first, it looked like a person standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. But something about it was wrong. It was too tall, its limbs too long, and its face, or what should have been its face, was obscured by the darkness. It was completely still, not moving, not making a sound, just standing there, watching us. We all froze. "What the hell is that?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. Jake, always the skeptic, squinted into the dark. "It's probably just a tree or something," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Trees don't look like that," Natalie muttered. Without saying another word, we backed up toward the porch, our eyes never leaving the figure. But as we moved, it seemed to move too. Only, not like a person would. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, as if it was being pulled along by invisible strings. And the tapping, it was louder now, more frantic, though we still couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. By the time we reached the porch, we bolted inside, locking the door behind us. No one spoke for a moment, the air thick with fear. Finally, Chris broke the silence. We should leave. But when we tried to get a signal on our phones, there was nothing. No service, no 1 fee. We couldn't even get the GPS to load. We were completely cut off. "All right, we just need to wait until morning," Jake said, trying to sound calm, though I could see the panic in his eyes. That night, none of us slept. We huddled in the living room, the fire burning low, listening to the sounds outside. Now and then we'd hear the tapping again, moving around the cabin, sometimes on the windows, sometimes on the walls. It never stayed in one place for long. At some point during the night, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was eerily silent. Lisa was the first to notice. "Where's Jake?" We looked around, but there was no sign of him. His jacket was still by the door, and his shoes were still in the hallway. He hadn't taken any of his things. Panic set in as we searched the cabin, calling his name, but he was gone. Eventually, we ventured outside, hoping to find some clue as to where he might have gone. That's when we saw the footprints, Jake's boot prints, leading from the porch, straight into the woods. We followed them for as long as we could, but after about a mile, they just stopped. There was no sign of him, no broken branches, no disturbed leaves. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. We searched for hours, but it was useless. By the time we made it back to the cabin, it was getting dark again, and the fear was palpable. We packed up our things and left as fast as we could, driving down the narrow roads, not stopping until we were back in town. We reported Jake's disappearance to the authorities, but they never found anything. No sign of him, no trace of where he had gone. It was like he had simply disappeared. It's been months now, and I still can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear tapping at my window. I'll look outside, and there'll be nothing there, just the wind in the trees. But I know it's not just the wind. I grew up in a small town called Willow Creek, nestled between thick forests and rolling hills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and the rumors flew faster than the wind. One particular story was whispered among us kids, the legend of the shadows. It started innocently enough, just another tale to scare the younger ones. The story said that if you ventured too far into the woods at night, the shadows would come alive, luring you deeper into the trees until you were lost forever. They'd whisper your name, promising secrets and treasures hidden within the forest. Most of us dismissed it as nonsense, a way for parents to keep their kids from wandering off. But as I grew older, I began to question what was out there. One summer evening, my friends and I decided to test the legend. It was the night of the summer solstice, and the moon was full, casting a silvery glow across the town. I was with my friends Max, Sarah, and Jake, each of us fueled by a mix of adrenaline and bravado. We grabbed flashlights and set off into the woods, the stories echoing in the back of our minds. The deeper we went, the more the trees seemed to close in around us. The familiar sounds of the town faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of an owl. We laughed and joked, but an unsettling feeling crept in, as shadows danced just beyond the reach of our flashlights. "Okay, who wants to go first?" Max said, trying to sound brave but failing to hide his unease. "I'll go," Jake offered, puffing out his chest. "What's the worst that could happen?" As we walked deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air grew cooler, and the shadows seemed to shift, almost like they were alive. But we pressed on, determined to prove that the legends were just that, legends. We reached a clearing where the moonlight poured in, illuminating the ground beneath us. It felt strangely serene, but I still had an itch of discomfort. Sarah shone her flashlight around, illuminating the surrounding trees, and that's when we saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was tall and dark, blending seamlessly with the shadows. At first I thought it was just another tree, but then it moved. My heart dropped as it stepped forward, a long, thin arm reaching out toward us. "Guys, I don't think this is a good idea," I stammered, backing up slowly. But the figure didn't seem to be threatening. It merely stood there, watching us, its presence somehow compelling. The whispers began then, soft, almost musical, echoing through the clearing. I strained to hear what it was saying, but the words were unintelligible, flowing like water through my mind. "Stay," it seemed to urge. "Stay with us." "Maybe it's friendly," Sarah whispered, her curiosity piqued. "Friendly? Are you kidding?" I shot back. "We need to leave, now." But Jake stepped forward, drawn in by the figure's enigmatic presence. "Come on, don't be such a wuss. It's just a shadow." With that, he moved closer, and I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. The moment he crossed the threshold of the clearing, the shadows around us began to shift and swirl, enveloping him like a dark mist. He froze in place, staring into the depths of the woods. "Jake," Sarah called, her voice trembling. There was no response. "Jake, come back," I shouted, my heart racing. But the figure seemed to be pulling him in, and he didn't even flinch. Before we could react, the shadows surged forward, swallowing Jake whole. I felt a chill grip my spine as I turned to run, grabbing Sarah and Max by the arms. We sprinted back the way we came, the whispers growing louder, almost mocking us. "Don't leave," they echoed, wrapping around us like a cold embrace. "Join us." We broke through the tree line, bursting into the clearing we had started from. Panting and gasping for breath, we stumbled back toward the town. The shadows loomed just beyond the trees, but we couldn't look back. Not now. Once we reached the safety of the streetlights, we stopped to catch our breath. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could barely comprehend what had just happened. We looked at each other, fear etched on our faces. "What the hell was that?" Max breathed, still trying to process everything. "Where's Jake?" Sarah's voice trembled, eyes wide with terror. He's gone," I stammered, the weight of realization crashing down on me. We had left him behind. The three of us spent the night pacing in Sarah's living room, unable to shake the images of what we had seen. We called his phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. I couldn't sleep, haunted by the idea that we had abandoned him to whatever that thing was. By morning, the fear had settled into a dull ache of regret. We contacted the authorities, who organized a search party to comb the woods. The search lasted for days, but they found nothing. No traces of Jake, no signs of struggle, just the deep silence of the woods. Weeks turned into months, and life in Willow Creek moved on, but I couldn't. Every night I dreamt of Jake, trapped in the shadows, his face a mask of confusion and fear. I could hear the whispers calling me, promising secrets and treasures if I only returned to the woods. It was a Friday night when I finally decided to go back. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was still out there, lost in the woods, and I had to find him. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the forest, the moon guiding me through the trees. As I walked deeper into the woods, the familiar unease settled in. The shadows seemed thicker this time, wrapping around the trees like a cloak. I could hear the whispers calling my name, luring me deeper. "Jake," I shouted into the darkness, my voice echoing off the trees. "I'm coming for you." The shadows shifted, swirling around me. I pressed on, determined to find him. The clearing came into view, just as it had before, and there stood the figure, tall, dark, and waiting. "Join us," it whispered, its voice smooth and seductive. "No," I shouted back, feeling the darkness pressing in around me. "Where's Jake?" The figure moved closer, extending its long arm. "He's with us now. Forever." I felt my heart race as I stared into the void where its face should be. The whispers grew louder, promising secrets, promising escape from my pain. But then, I heard something else, a faint voice carried on the wind. "Help me," it was Jake's voice. I felt a surge of determination and fear wash over me. "Jake!" I screamed, stepping forward despite the shadows clawing at me. "I'm here." Suddenly, the whispers turned to wails, and the shadows lunged. I could feel them wrapping around my legs, pulling me down. I fought against it, forcing myself forward. "Jake!" I cried, pushing through the darkness. Just as I felt myself being pulled into the void, I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. Jake! He was there, his face pale and terrified, reaching out for me. "Please don't leave me," he shouted, his eyes wide with fear. With a final burst of strength I lunged for him, grasping his hand as the shadows screamed in fury. Light exploded around us, pushing the darkness back. Together, we stumbled backward, breaking free from the clutches of the void. We fell into the clearing, gasping for air as the shadows receded, howling in frustration. I pulled Jake to his feet, and together we ran, not stopping until we were back at the tree line, the safety of the moonlight enveloping us. We never spoke of that night again. The whispers faded, and the shadows retreated into the woods. Jake and I left Willow Creek behind, the legend of the shadows lingering in our memories, but we knew the truth, that some legends are better left undisturbed. And though we escaped, I could still hear the whispers calling, echoing in the corners of my mind. Every small town has its secrets, and the most infamous one in Greystone was Hartman Manor. It sat on the edge of town, looming like a specter against the night sky, its weathered walls bearing the weight of generations. I grew up hearing the stories. The children whispered about the mansion being haunted. The adults warned against trespassing. But like most kids, I was drawn to the legend. It was the summer before my senior year, and I decided to explore the manor with my friends, Tom, Lisa, and Max. We had spent countless evenings sharing ghost stories around campfires, and now it was time to put our courage to the test. Tom, the ringleader of our group, was always eager for a thrill. "Come on, it'll be fun. We'll prove there's nothing to be scared of," he urged, a wicked grin on his face. Lisa, ever the cautious one, looked hesitant. "What if we do see a ghost?" she asked, her voice wavering. Max, who had his own experience with haunted places, chimed in. "I've heard the stories too. People say strange things happen in that house, but it's probably just a bunch of old creaks and shadows." Despite the warnings, curiosity got the better of us, and as twilight fell, we made our way to Hartman Manor. The path leading up to the house was overgrown with weeds, and the once grand entrance was flanked by crumbling statues covered in moss. I could feel a chill in the air, but we pressed on, excitement overriding our apprehension. As we entered the manor, the door creaked ominously behind us. Dust hung in the air like a thick fog, and the smell of mildew invaded my nostrils. We stepped into the foyer, where a grand staircase spiraled upward into darkness. Faded portraits lined the walls, their subjects gazing down at us with hollow eyes. It felt as if they were watching, judging. "All right, let's split up," Tom suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way. We'll meet back here in an hour." Lisa hesitated, but Tom's enthusiasm was infectious. "Fine, but I'm sticking with you, Sam," she said, clinging to my side. Max partnered with Tom, and they headed toward the dining room. As Lisa and I explored the ground floor, I could feel a sense of foreboding wash over me. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath our feet, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, lurking just out of sight. We wandered into the parlor, where old furniture lay draped in white sheets like ghosts in mourning. "This place is so creepy," Lisa whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I nodded, my heart racing. Just as I was about to suggest we find the others, a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, making the sheets flutter like spectral wings. "Did you feel that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yeah," Lisa replied, her eyes wide. "What was that?" We exchanged nervous glances, but curiosity got the best of us. I ventured toward a dusty piano in the corner, my fingers brushing across the keys. The sound echoed through the empty house, a low, haunting note that sent shivers down my spine. "Stop! You're going to wake up the ghosts," Lisa joked, trying to lighten the mood, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "Come on, it's just a piano," I said, chuckling nervously. But as I turned to face her, I noticed something in the mirror on the wall, a fleeting shadow darting behind us. My heart dropped. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "See what?" Lisa replied, confused. "Something just moved behind us," I insisted, turning back to the mirror. There was nothing there, only our reflections staring back, looking frightened and small. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling of dread creeping in. Suddenly we heard a loud crash from the direction of the dining room. I jumped, and Lisa's eyes widened in fear. "What was that?" she gasped. "Let's go find Tom and Max," I suggested, my instincts kicking in. We hurried down the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the silence. As we reached the dining room, I saw Tom and Max standing by the overturned table, wide-eyed and shaken. "What happened?" I asked. Max pointed to the broken china scattered on the floor. "We were just looking around when all of a sudden..." He glanced back at Tom, who was pale and shaking. "There was a voice," Tom stammered. "It said my name." Lisa and I exchanged worried looks. "You're kidding, right?" I asked, but deep down, I knew he wasn't. "I swear, it came from the kitchen," Tom said, his eyes darting toward the darkened doorway. "Let's check it out," I said, trying to sound brave, but my heart raced as we approached the kitchen, the air growing colder with every step. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the grime-covered windows. The old appliances stood like forgotten sentinels, and as we stepped further in, I noticed a figure in the corner, a woman in a long, tattered dress. Her back was turned to us, but I could feel her presence, heavy and oppressive. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. The woman turned slowly, and when I saw her face, my blood ran cold. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits of despair, and her mouth twisted into a sorrowful smile. "Leave," she whispered, her voice echoing in the room like a mournful wind. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed Lisa's arm, pulling her back. "We need to go. Now." We ran from the kitchen, racing back to the foyer where we had split up earlier. But the atmosphere of the manor had shifted dramatically. The shadows seemed to stretch and pulse, coiling around us like tendrils. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling in my mind, echoing the woman's command to leave. "Tom, we can't stay here," I shouted, but he and Max stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear. "We can't just leave," Tom said, his voice shaky. "What if we leave and—" "Let's just go," Lisa pleaded, but before we could move, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the house, shaking the very foundation. "Great, we're trapped," Max exclaimed, panic rising in his voice. "Everyone, stay together," I shouted, trying to maintain some semblance of control. We backed away from the door, the whispers intensifying around us, now a cacophony of tortured voices begging for release. We turned and sprinted toward the staircase, hoping to find another way out. As we ascended the stairs, the shadows surged around us, blocking our path. It felt as if the house itself was alive, twisting and contorting to keep us trapped. "Go, go," I yelled, shoving Lisa ahead of me. We reached the second floor, and frantically searched for a window. But every room we entered was filled with dust and despair, as if time had forgotten them. The walls felt alive, closing in on us. Finally, we stumbled upon a room at the end of the hallway. It had an old, painted window, and I rushed toward it, pushing against the frame. It wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into wails, drowning out my thoughts and consuming my sanity. I turned back to the others, desperation clawing at my chest. "Help me!" I shouted, as Tom and Max joined me in trying to force the window open. Just then, the woman appeared again, standing in the doorway, blocking our escape. "You cannot leave," she whispered, her voice a chilling echo. "You belong to me now." I felt a cold dread wash over me, and I knew we were out of time. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged at her, shoving her aside. To my surprise, she dissipated into the shadows, leaving only a lingering chill in the air. "Go," I yelled, throwing my shoulder against the window one last time. It shattered with a deafening crash, glass raining down like deadly confetti. We scrambled through the opening, tumbling onto the roof of the porch. The night air hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I felt alive again. We didn't stop to look back, leaping from the porch and sprinting into the woods, the whispers chasing us into the darkness. As we reached the tree line, I turned for a brief moment, catching a glimpse of the manor. The windows glowed with a malevolent light, and I could see shadows dancing behind them, their forms twisting and writhing in anger. We ran until we reached the edge of town, gasping for breath, fear coursing through our veins. We didn't speak of that night again. We left Hartman Manor behind, its secrets buried in the shadows, but I knew we would never truly escape its grasp. Even now, years later, I still hear the whispers at night, haunting my dreams, reminding me of what lies within those walls. And I know, deep down, that Hartman Manor will always be waiting, ready to claim its next victim. In the quiet town of Pine Hollow, whispers of the old cabin in the woods had circulated for years. It was a place shrouded in mystery and fear, a structure that seemed to breathe with the forest around it. Locals claimed it was haunted, a place where those who entered never returned. It became a source of dread and fascination, particularly for my friends and me. It was the summer before we headed off to college, and we were itching for one last adventure. "Let's go check out the cabin," said Jake, the most impulsive of our group. His eyes sparkled with mischief, and I knew it was only a matter of time before we'd all be swept up in his enthusiasm. "Are you serious?" Sarah replied, her voice laced with skepticism. "What if the stories are true? Come on, it'll be fun," Jake insisted, throwing his arm around her shoulders. "We'll bring flashlights and some snacks, and we'll be back before midnight. What could happen?" After a bit more coaxing, we agreed. I wasn't particularly keen on the idea, but the thrill of adventure was too enticing to resist. So, that night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we set off into the woods. The path was overgrown, thick with weeds and brambles, and the air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The deeper we went, the more the world around us faded into a whisper of the town we'd left behind. As we walked, an eerie silence enveloped us, broken only by the sound of our footsteps crunching the leaves beneath us. "Are we sure we're going the right way?" Sarah asked, glancing back at the dimming trail. "Just a little further," Jake assured her, although I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. After what felt like an eternity, we finally stumbled upon the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of time. Vines twisted around the beams, and broken windows stared out like hollow eyes. "Here it is," Jake said, stepping forward. "Looks like a perfect spot for a little exploration." The door creaked as we pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and neglect. Cobwebs hung from the corners, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. A fireplace stood cold and empty, its stones blackened and cracked. "Let's set our stuff down," I suggested, trying to break the tension. "We can explore for a bit, then head back." We dropped our backpacks, and Jake led the way into what appeared to be the main room. Old photographs lined the walls, faded faces staring out at us from a time long gone. Their expressions seemed to shift in the low light, an unsettling feeling crawling up my spine. "Look at this!" Jake exclaimed, holding up an old leather-bound book he found on a rickety table. He blew the dust off, and the pages crinkled under his touch. "It's a journal. Probably just some old nonsense," Sarah said, but her curiosity piqued. We gathered around as Jake flipped through the pages, the scrawled handwriting barely legible. "It talks about the family that used to live here," Jake said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They believed the woods were cursed. Said they could hear voices at night, things calling out to them." "What kind of things?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant, though my heart raced. Jake read aloud. "They claimed the forest wanted to claim them, that if they didn't leave, they would become part of it." The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening around us. "This is just a creepy story," I said, but the way Jake was reading made it hard to shake the unease settling in my stomach. As the night wore on, we explored the cabin, but every corner we turned felt like we were being watched. The atmosphere thickened, and whispers began to fill the air, soft at first, almost like the rustling of leaves. "Did you hear that?" Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Just the wind," Jake replied, though he didn't sound convinced. We eventually decided to sit down, sharing snacks in a circle on the dusty floor. The tension lightened a bit as we joked and laughed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "Let's do a ghost story," Jake suggested. "You know, to keep the vibe going." "Seriously? Here?" Sarah protested, but it was too late. Jake had already started, weaving tales of hauntings and curses, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. As he spoke, the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a rising wind. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Okay, enough with the ghost stories," I said, trying to inject some humor back into the group. "Let's focus on getting out of here." Just then the door slammed shut, rattling on its hinges. We froze, the laughter dying in our throats. "What the hell was that?" Greg whispered, his face pale. "Maybe it's just the wind," I said, trying to sound brave, but my voice trembled. Jake stood up, his bravado faltering. "I'll check it out," he said, but the uncertainty in his voice was clear. "Don't," Sarah cried. "Let's just leave." Before I could protest, Jake opened the door. A gust of cold air rushed in, and the whispers turned into a chorus of anguished cries. The shadows in the cabin twisted, and the walls seemed to close in around us. "Close it, close it!" I shouted, fear gripping my chest. Jake stumbled back, and the door slammed shut again, almost as if it had a mind of its own. "What the hell is happening?" Greg yelled, backing away from the door. We all huddled together, our breaths coming in quick, panicked gasps. "We need to get out of here," I insisted, grabbing the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. "Try the windows," Sarah suggested, darting toward one. We scrambled toward the windows, but each one was stuck as if sealed by an unseen force. The whispers intensified, filling the room with a cacophony of despair. "Let us out!" I screamed, banging on the walls, but the cabin seemed to pulse with life, feeding off our fear. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching us. My heart dropped. "What is that?" I pointed, my voice barely a whisper. We turned to look, but the figure vanished, leaving only darkness in its wake. "Get away from there," Jake shouted, pulling us back toward the center of the room. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, and the walls seemed to close in even further. The whispers turned into wails, haunting cries echoing in our minds. Stay with us." "No, we have to go," I screamed, desperation clawing at my throat. In a panic we banged on the walls, our voices rising above the chaos. "Help! Someone help us!" But the cabin answered with silence, the whispers now an angry roar. Just when I thought we would be swallowed whole, the floorboards beneath us began to tremble, shaking violently. "Get back!" I yelled, as the ground opened up, revealing a dark abyss. We stumbled backward, our backs hitting the walls. "What is happening?" Sarah cried, her eyes wide with terror. I could feel the energy in the room shifting as if the very essence of the cabin was alive and hungry. The darkness beckoned us, promising escape but threatening to consume us. "Together," Jake shouted, grabbing my hand and then reaching for Sarah and Greg. "On 3, we run for the door." We nodded, our breaths shaky, and counted down. 1, T2, T3. With all our might, we charged for the door, the whispers reaching a fever pitch. I could feel the cold air biting at my skin as we raced toward freedom. The door flew open, and we stumbled out into the night, the forest around us alive with sound. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods, gasping for breath, the cabin looming behind us like a dark specter. "What just happened?" Greg panted, his face pale. "I don't know," I replied, trembling. "But we can never go back there." We never spoke of that night again. But the memory haunted me. Eldridge Hollow had claimed its victims, those who ventured too close to the cabin, drawn in by whispers of darkness and despair. Even now, years later, when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear the echoes of those voices, urging me to return. And deep down, I know the cabin is still there, waiting for the next unwary soul to wander too close. In the heart of the countryside, tucked away from prying eyes, stood the remnants of the old Holloway Asylum. It had been abandoned for decades, a crumbling structure overtaken by nature. Vines crawled up its stone walls and shattered windows gaped like empty sockets. Whispers about the asylum spread through our small town, tales of the tortured souls who once roamed its halls. Some claimed they could still hear the echoes of their screams on quiet nights. When my friends and I decided to investigate, it wasn't just curiosity that drove us. It was a dare, a challenge to confront the ghosts of a forgotten past. Jake, ever the instigator, rallied us. "Let's go in, it'll be fun. Besides, I've heard the best ghost stories come from places like this." "Are you serious?" Sarah replied, eyeing the looming structure with skepticism. "That place is dangerous. People have disappeared near it." "Those are just stories," Jake shot back, his bravado unwavering. "We'll be fine. It's just an old building." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, we made our way to the asylum. The air grew heavy, a sense of foreboding wrapping around us as we stepped through the rusted gate. We could feel the weight of history pressing down, the memories of pain and suffering seeping through the very walls. The front door creaked open, revealing a dark foyer that smelled of mildew and decay. Dust motes danced in our flashlights, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. A chill crept up my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Let's stick together, I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. The last thing we want is to get lost in here. Jake led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. We moved cautiously, the beams of light revealing peeling wallpaper and remnants of furniture long forgotten. The further we ventured, the more I felt the air thicken, as if the asylum itself was alive, breathing with the remnants of its past. "Look at this," Jake called, shining his light on a door marked, "Patient Ward." The handle turned easily, and with a deep breath, he pushed it open. Inside, the room was lined with rusted beds, each one a stark reminder of the lives that had once been confined here. Stripped of their sheets, the beds looked like skeletons waiting for their lost souls to return. We stepped cautiously inside, the atmosphere oppressive. "Do you think they did experiments on the patients?" Greg asked, glancing at the tattered medical equipment scattered around. "Probably," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place gives me the creeps." We heard a sound, soft and distant, echoing through the halls. It was a low, mournful moan that sent shivers down my spine. I exchanged nervous glances with my friends, but Jake was undeterred. "It's just the wind," he said, but even he sounded less certain. "Let's check out the next room." As we moved deeper into the asylum, the moaning grew louder, almost as if it were calling out to us. "We should think about heading back," I said, my unease growing with every step. "Don't be such a wuss," Jake shot back, but I could see the fear flickering in his eyes. We entered a small room that looked like it had once been a recreation area. Old board games lay strewn across the floor, and a rusted piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed and chipped. Sarah approached it, her fingers brushing over the keys. "Let's see if it still works," she said. But as she pressed down, a dissonant chord echoed through the room, sending a wave of discomfort through us. Suddenly, the moaning grew deafening, reverberating through the asylum. "What the hell is that?" Greg shouted, his eyes wide. "Let's get out of here," I yelled, but before we could react, the door slammed shut behind us. Panic surged as we rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The moaning intensified, filling the air with anguish. Shadows danced around us, growing darker and more defined. "Jake, do something!" Sarah cried, desperation creeping into her voice. "Just give it a minute," he said, his bravado fading. "Maybe it'll open on its own." But as the shadows closed in, I could feel the temperature drop, the air thickening with despair. "We're trapped," I shouted, my heart racing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure materialize. A woman, dressed in a tattered hospital gown, her eyes hollow and pleading. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. They won't let me go," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "You must help me." "Help you how?" Jake asked, stepping forward despite his fear. "What do you want from us?" "Find the truth," she pleaded. "Free us from this place." The shadows surged around us, the moaning growing louder, almost drowning out her voice. "What truth?" I yelled, desperation clawing at my throat. "Follow the screams," she wailed, her figure flickering as if she were caught between worlds. Just then the door burst open, and we stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. We didn't look back, running past door after door, our flashlights flickering in the dark. "Where do we go?" Sarah panted, fear in her eyes. "Downstairs," Jake shouted, and we turned, racing toward the staircase. The moaning grew louder behind us, echoing through the halls as if the very walls were alive, trapping us in a nightmare. We descended the stairs 2 at a time, desperate to escape the grip of the asylum. As we reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a dimly lit basement filled with remnants of the past. Old medical charts, rusty instruments, and discarded patient belongings. In the far corner, a door stood ajar, and from within came the same anguished cries we had heard earlier. "Help us! Help us!" The voices echoed a chorus of despair calling out for salvation. "Do we want to go in there?" Greg asked, his voice trembling. "We have to find out," Jake insisted. "If we don't, we'll never be free of this place." With trepidation we pushed the door open, revealing a small room lined with dark stains and remnants of old equipment. In the center stood a rusted operating table, and above it hung a flickering light, casting shadows that danced eerily. As we stepped inside, the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The cries grew louder, now filling the room. "Help us! Help us!" They were desperate, filled with anguish. In the corner of the room, we spotted a large, dusty mirror. The surface shimmered, and we could see distorted reflections of ourselves, twisted and grotesque. It felt as if the mirror were alive, pulling at our very souls. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Focus on the truth," Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the despair. "We need to understand what happened here." As we gathered around the mirror, the cries intensified, and a vision flooded our minds. We saw scenes of chaos, patients strapped to tables, tortured and abandoned by those who were supposed to care for them. Shadows moved in the corners, figures watching with cold, calculating eyes. "No! No!" I screamed, the horror overwhelming. "We can't let this happen." The cries became deafening, filling our minds with anguish. We had to do something. "We need to break the mirror," I shouted, desperate for a way to free the trapped souls. "Are you crazy?" Greg protested. "What if it makes things worse? Or maybe it will set them free," I argued, feeling the weight of their suffering pressing down on us. In a moment of determination, I picked up a rusted chair and swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered, and a wave of energy surged through the room. The cries turned to wails, and the shadows erupted in chaos. As the mirror shattered, a blinding light engulfed us, and for a moment, I felt weightless. The room spun, and then suddenly, it was quiet. We found ourselves back in the foyer, disoriented but alive. The air felt lighter, and the shadows that had haunted us were gone. "Did we do it?" Jake asked, glancing around in disbelief. I think we did," I replied, my heart still racing. But just as relief washed over us, a chill crept back in, and we turned to see the figure of the woman standing at the entrance, her expression one of gratitude mixed with sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered, before fading into the light. At that moment we understood we had freed the souls trapped within the asylum. As we stepped outside, the night air felt fresh and new, the oppressive weight of the past lifting away. Though the memories of the asylum would haunt us forever, we confronted the darkness and emerged stronger. The Holloway Asylum was no longer a place of fear. It had transformed into a testament to the power of truth and the need for closure. As we walked away, I glanced back at the building one last time. It stood silent, no longer a fortress of despair, but a place of forgotten history, a reminder that some ghosts are meant to be set free. In a small town where rumors spread like wildfire, the old Grayson estate was the subject of hushed conversations and fearful glances. Abandoned for decades, it was said to be cursed, haunted by the ghost of a woman who had vanished without a trace. The house loomed over the town like a dark sentinel, its windows like hollow eyes watching every move. As a group of friends, we often joked about the stories, but deep down, we knew the place was off limits. It was a chilly autumn evening when Jake proposed an expedition. "Let's explore the Grayson estate," he said, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "It'll be a blast." "Are you out of your mind?" Sarah shot back. "You want to go there? Everyone knows it's haunted." "Exactly. We'll prove it's just a bunch of nonsense," he replied, undeterred. Despite our reservations, his enthusiasm was infectious. So, armed with flashlights and a sense of reckless adventure, we set off toward the estate after sunset. The air grew colder as we approached, and the trees seemed to close in around us, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere. As we stepped onto the property, the ground crunched beneath our feet, twigs and leaves mingling with the remnants of overgrown grass. The house towered above us, its once grand facade now marred by peeling paint and ivy creeping up the walls. "Here goes nothing," Jake said, pushing open the creaking front door. It groaned in protest, revealing a darkened hallway that smelled of mildew and decay. We stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind us as if the house had decided to keep us within its grasp. "Great," Sarah muttered. "Now we can't leave." "Relax, it's probably just the wind," Jake replied, though I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The interior was a labyrinth of dust and shadows. Faded wallpaper hung limply from the walls, and the air was thick with a palpable silence that felt almost alive. We moved cautiously, our flashlights flickering against the darkness, illuminating strange shapes and long-forgotten furniture. "Let's check out the upstairs," Jake suggested, leading the way. As we climbed the creaking staircase, the temperature dropped even further, sending chills down my spine. "I don't like this," I whispered, my heart racing. "Just think of it as an adventure," Jake called back, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. At the top we found ourselves in a long corridor lined with doors, each one closed tight. "Which one should we try first?" Greg asked, glancing nervously down the hallway. "Let's go for the one at the end," Jake decided, striding forward. We followed, unease settling in as we reached the last door. Jake hesitated for a moment before throwing it open. The room was dark, but as our flashlights swept across the walls, we found ourselves staring at a massive mirror that dominated the space. Its ornate frame was gilded and tarnished, and the surface was coated in a thick layer of dust. "Check this out," Jake exclaimed, stepping closer. "Don't touch it," Sarah warned. "What if it's—" But it was too late. Jake reached out and wiped the dust from the mirror's surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as if stirred from a deep sleep, the glass rippled, and a dark figure appeared behind him. "Jake!" I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by a low, haunting wail that emanated from the mirror. He turned, and the figure vanished, leaving only his startled reflection. "What was that?" he stammered, his bravado evaporating. "Let's get out of here," Greg urged, stepping back, but the mirror held our gaze, a dark allure pulling us closer. As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut again, this time with a violent force. Panic surged through us. "What the hell?" Jake yelled, tugging at the doorknob. "I can't get it open," Sarah screamed, pushing against the door. The mirror began to shimmer, and suddenly, we saw images within it, flashes of a woman in a long white dress, her face twisted in anguish. She reached out as if begging for help, her mouth forming silent words. "Is she trying to tell us something?" I murmured, drawn to her sorrowful eyes. "Stop looking at it," Greg shouted, panic rising. "We need to focus on getting out," but it was too late. The wails grew louder, enveloping us in a cacophony of despair. Shadows twisted and danced around the room, and the temperature plummeted even further. "Help us! Help us!" the woman cried, her voice echoing in our minds. "Let's break a window," I suggested, my mind racing as I searched for a way out. "No. We need to figure out what she wants," Jake insisted, stepping closer to the mirror. "Are you insane?" Sarah shouted. "We need to get out of here now." But Jake was transfixed, staring into the mirror as if it were a portal. The woman's image shifted, revealing scenes of the past, flashes of the Grayson family living happily, only to be overshadowed by tragedy. A dark figure loomed in the background, watching and waiting. "Look! There's something behind her," Jake pointed, his voice trembling. The shadowy figure in the background became clearer, a man with hollow eyes, his face twisted in malice. The woman recoiled, and we could feel her terror radiating from the mirror. Suddenly the room shook violently, and the mirror shattered, the glass flying in every direction. We screamed, ducking for cover as shards rained down around us. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the door. Jake and Greg were right behind us, and we slammed against the door, our combined weight finally forcing it open. We stumbled into the hallway, the echoes of our screams bouncing off the walls. We didn't stop running until we reached the staircase, but as we raced down, we realized the shadows were following us, whispering in voices that promised despair. Stay with us." We burst through the front door, and out into the night, collapsing on the ground as the cool air hit our faces. The Grayson estate loomed behind us, dark and silent, as if it were holding its breath. "What just happened?" Sarah panted, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know," I replied, still shaking. "But we have to tell someone." We scrambled to our feet, not daring to look back. The whispers faded as we made our way down the path, the feeling of being watched lingering in the air. In the following days we tried to make sense of what had happened, but the memory of the mirror haunted us. We learned that the Grayson family had suffered a tragedy. The woman in the mirror had been the last of her kin, lost to a dark fate. The tales of the estate weren't just rumors, They were a warning. Weeks passed, and life went on, but we couldn't escape the lingering sense of dread. Every time the wind howled, I could hear those whispers calling out, echoing in my mind. The pull of the mirror haunted Jake, who became obsessed with returning to uncover its secrets. "No," I argued one night. "We can't go back there. You saw what happened." "I have to know," he insisted, determination written across his face. "If we don't confront it, it'll just keep haunting us." The following weekend, Jake vanished without a word. My heart sank as dread crept over me. Sarah and Greg were equally worried, and we spent hours searching the woods, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. In a panic, I found myself standing before the Grayson estate again, the memories flooding back. The whispers grew louder as I stepped onto the property, and fear gripped me. I pushed the door open, and the air grew colder. "Jake?" I called, my voice trembling. As I ventured inside, the house felt different, alive and watching. The shadows loomed larger, twisting around me as I searched each room, calling for my friend. Finally I reached the room with the shattered mirror. The air was thick with sorrow, and the remnants of the glass lay scattered on the floor. "Jake!" I screamed, desperation clawing at my throat, but only silence answered. Suddenly the mirror reformed, its surface rippling like water. The woman appeared again, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and warning. "Help us," she whispered. "No, where's Jake?" he cried, my heart racing. The shadows around me thickened, pressing in as if trying to swallow me whole. "Stay, stay," they whispered, and I could feel the darkness trying to claim me. Just as I felt myself slipping, I remembered the journal Jake had found. The answers had to be there. I scrambled through the debris, my fingers brushing against the leather cover. Flipping it open, I frantically searched for clues, for anything that might explain how to break the curse. The pages were filled with tales of despair, but one entry stood out: a ritual to free the trapped souls. With a surge of determination, I began to recite the words, the air around me vibrating with energy. The shadows recoiled, and the whispers turned to screams echoing in anger. "Leave us!" I shouted, feeling the power of the words take hold. The mirror shattered once more, but this time, a light burst forth, illuminating the room. The shadows screamed and writhed, retreating as the light engulfed everything. In the wake of the explosion of light, I fell to my knees, breathless. The room was quiet, the air lighter than before. "Jake!" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. But there was no response. In the days that followed, I was consumed by guilt and fear. I had confronted the darkness, but at what cost? The estate remained, an empty shell, and Jake was gone. Though I escaped the grasp of the mirror, I would forever be haunted by the memories of that night. The Grayson estate stood as a grim reminder of the price of curiosity, and the darkness that waits behind every reflection. The whispers might have faded, but the secrets within that cursed house would remain, waiting for the next unwary soul to venture too close.